Okay, in this lecture, we're going to continue to discuss some of the ways that this disregard for environmental concerns is achieved. And one of the things we're going to talk about is the idea of corporate suasion. Again, looks very much like the word persuasion, which is it's related to. This is influence not gained by force or compulsion. So in other words, not making somebody believe something, but again, we was talking about this idea of persuasion, right? Causing someone or winning them over to your side. And so when we think about this idea, as we talked about in the last lecture, it's pretty much universally understood that in order to address these issues about the impact we're having on the planet, it's going to require more regulation, as we saw in our examples of acid rain in the ozone layer, right? If we're going to do this, we have to identify what the issue is and then enforce regulations largely on corporations to achieve the ultimate goals that will reduce the impact on the planet. So environmentalists, those people we say are fighting for these goals, want regulation. Of course, as we talked about from a very earlier module, corporations oppose regulation and often form alliances in order to achieve that. So again, in 1971, there were 175 firms represented by lobbyists. Okay, lobbyists are those people who are hired to represent corporate interests and influence government officials. In other words, people who are establishing policies. So in 1971, 175 corporations were represented by lobbyists. In 1981, a decade later, that number was up to 2,445. So from 175 to 2,445 firms were routinely engaged in using lobbyists to influence regulations in government. Again, in the late 1970s, U.S. businesses spent about $1 billion a year to persuade the public that corporate interests are the same as their interests. That idea of the friendly corporation, the idea of what we want is what you want is what we want, and those are the same thing. And again, in 1975, about 22% of the public thought there was too much regulation. By 1980, 5 years later, that number was up to 60%. So we've seen that this has been effective, right? This idea of corporations have been able to largely persuade us that regulation equals bad, right? And there's some specific things that have gone on, and we're going to take a look at this list here. As we talked about in the last lecture, one of the things about science is science acknowledges uncertainty, right? This concept of nothing can be proven beyond reasonable doubt. There's always exceptions to the rule. Nothing's 100%. These are all common things that we'll often hear in well-done science, right? In sociology as well. There's no such thing as a hard and fast rule. All these kind of things. But as long as scientific uncertainty exists, it can be exploited by people who want to question the outcomes of scientific research. So again, all scientific research suffers from some type of methodology difficulty, right? The idea that there's no such thing as a perfect experiment. Outcomes are not, beyond a reasonable doubt. And again, so it's that idea of, okay, so a scientist can say, and many scientists have, human behavior is causing global warming, and all someone has to do is say, I see a problem with your research, and therefore I'm not going to listen to it anymore. And again, those methodological problems are inescapable. They exist, right? Also, that kind of call for more research, right? So we've seen this definitely, as I did the timeline in the last one from the 1990s. Increasing numbers of scientists have been saying that this is the results of their research, and a skeptic, all they have to say is, okay, I need more research, right? Okay, I see what you said, more. Again, it's what we might consider to be a stalling tactic. often used the idea of, okay, so 2 people say it, I need to hear it from 10. 10 people say it, I need to hear it from 50. 50 people say it, I need to hear it from 200. And again, a lot of research is also done by corporations themselves. And if the outcomes of that research are unfavorable, they can either suppress it, or in some cases, when they know there's research being done that they can have on agencies or by individuals they have influence on, they often do that to suppress unfavorable outcomes. A specific example of this was in the early 1990s, 1991 and 1992. The Environmental Protection Agency offered amnesty to companies for releasing this information, any information that they had regarding environmental impact that they hadn't published. And again, amnesty is a very important word. No consequences. So for corporations, this was the idea of, okay, we've been suppressing some things, and now the EPA is going to say, if we release this stuff, nothing can happen to us. So they're under actually a pretty good incentive to release these so that later on it couldn't come out and quote unquote bite them in the butt. Approximately between 1991 and 1992, 10,000 studies released by corporations that indicated substantial risks to public health regarding all sorts of different corporate behaviors because the corporations couldn't be. So it definitely pointed to this idea that when corporations sponsor or have influence over research and it shows unfavorable outcomes, they can suppress it. Again, this concept of use of public relations. I already talked about firms represented by lobbyists. When we talk about public relations, we're talking about efforts to, again, kind of influence the public to think that corporations are, quote unquote, on their side or good. Again, a direct quote from the text. It's easier and less costly to change the way people think about reality than it is to change reality. And that's a kind of a heady notion, but we've definitely talked about that when we've talked about social constructions, right? If we can make something an accepted social construction, then that, for the way all intents and purposes people think, is reality as opposed to what we might call real reality. And basically, corporations have learned that the best type of public relations is that which is passed off as news. Okay, so this relies on, sometimes talks about this concept of fake news, which again I'll provide a resource for in the course shell. The Wall Street Journal once said that more than half its news, the news it was publishing, was based solely on press releases by PR firms. One of the things we've seen in news organizations is a kind of condensation of these, where they're becoming more and more costly to run and hire less and less and less people. And corporations are in the habit of often producing what are called VNRs, video news releases. So these are by corporations or PR firms, which are released in the same type of style as news releases and then sent to news organizations who, much like a student who might, someone, who has a report or a paper due, and someone walks up and hands you the paper and you say, that's great, I don't have to do the work now, I'm turning that in. That these VNRs are shown by news organizations because they're made for them and they're cheap. But of course, the source is the public relations, which are working for corporations, which serve to forward their viewpoints and best interests. We've definitely seen a rise in what we sometimes call front groups, these organizations which represent corporate interests but don't seem to be, or seem to have misleading or vague names. So again, I'll give you a couple of quick examples. The Global Climate Coalition, the GCC, okay, and most people would hear that would probably think, oh, they're probably, environmentally concerned or concerned about the effects of global warming. The Global Climate Coalition is made up of 50 U.S. companies representing oil, gas, coal, automobile, and chemical interests. Okay? The Consumers for Responsible Solutions. Sounds like a bunch of people, interested in the health and well-being of society. The Consumers for Responsible Solutions is a group funded by Philip Morris to defeat anti-smoking campaigns. Okay, So again, corporations can put together these organizations, give them, like we said, false or misleading names, and then they work to forward corporate interests. Again, PR firms definitely sometimes in some ways speak out against other organizations, and they have the backing of a lot of resources to do that. Um, Again, PR firms largely are available to the highest paying, which is usually corporations, not smaller environmental groups. Two University of Denver professors invented this term, SLAPS, SLAPPS, right, which stands for Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation. Okay, as we know in our society, which is often described as a very litigious society, meaning if you deal with something, you take them to court, right? And that's called a lawsuit, right? So a strategic lawsuit against public participation. These are lawsuits filed against activists and organizations for such thing as defamation, right? Which is calling somebody names, basically. Being a nuisance, interfering with contracts. So corporations can slap somebody, right? File a lawsuit against them, and then what happens is, as a lawsuit plays out in court, you can tie the issue up in court, which is, of course, a very slow process. None of this happens immediately. The organization or individuals are being drained of their resources. They have to hire lawyers and prepare a defense against this, which, of course, costs money that they would probably be spending on other things. And then again, the message to other groups is this can happen to you too. So if an organization says this company's doing this, so let's go back to my little stream example from the earlier lecture. I go to that corporation that's pouring muck into the stream and I say, you're doing this. And they can file basically a lawsuit against me saying, you are defaming us, you're calling us names, you're falsely accusing us. Or if I protest, they can say, your protest is interfering with our ability to do our work, here at the job, or fulfill the contracts that we're doing. Then I can be sued by that firm, that organization, and again, costing me lots and lots of resources. And again, one of the things that is often looked at is other groups and other individuals say, "Oh my God, well look what happened to that Flavin guy. I'm not going to let that happen to me. I'll keep my mouth shut." Again, is this always effective? About 2/3 of most slaps, according to the researchers who did this, are dismissed before trial, and the majority of them are actually overturned on appeal. So legally, are they a good tactic? No. But again, the social aspect of it is to slow down and intimidate environmental groups. And then we can also talk about this concept of media and the role that it plays, as well as something very specific called media and censorship, right? The media is very critical in shaping popular constructions about social problems. Again, the media is largely, in today's America, owned and controlled by corporations, which don't want the media then criticizing them. Corporations influence the content of what's produced a lot of times in our media today. So there's not a lot of independent media that's not free from the influence or sometimes direct control of corporate interests. And while we are very, very, very in our society sensitive to government censorship, this idea of people saying what can and can't be said, where the people who stand up and say, I just realized it's called censorship wrong. That's S, right? So while we're very, very, very sensitive to the concept of government censorship, the government can't tell me what to do, can't tell me what not to say, First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, we often don't recognize to the degree to which the media is controlled by corporations, and then the corporations can decide what we do or do not hear. So again, pro-corporate bias is to protect its own interests and maximize profits, which most media today represents. We definitely know we've lost, to a large degree, a huge amount of the free press that America was once so very happy and proud of. And even just when we talk about this concept of, let's say there's a media, we're go back to this idea of exploring uncertainty. Sometimes we think about this as, we have to present both sides, right? So if a government organization comes up and says, you know, environmental organization comes up and says global warming, and then the media organization will say, well, we have to present both sides, and we'll give an equal amount of time to a person who debunks the science regarding this. We sometimes think about that as, fair and reasonable journalism. However, we definitely do it by presenting minority opinions, the minority opinions to be of equal status. So you could have the scientific community, 999 out of 1,000 scientists say global warming exists, and the media will often give that last person equal holding with the or equal representation with the idea that that person's opinions are just as valid. Again, this comes sometimes the example I use is, while it's a very small percentage of the population believe that the Earth is flat, right? If you were going to have let's have a debate about round Earth versus flat Earth, and you give equal sides, the same amount of time, it's certainly going to appear that each side is valid. Which, again, I'm sorry if I'm crushing any egos here. The Earth is not flat. The Earth is spherical, but that's the representation that's being given when we talk about this idea of corporate censorship. Okay, thank you.